and welcome. My name is Stefanie Linhardt, Europe editor at The Banker, and I'm here with Tina Fordham, Chief Global Political Analyst for Citigroup. Tina, welcome.
Thanks.
Last year, early in the year, we spoke about Brexit and Donald Trump potentially being elected as a US president as top political risks. Now, a lot of people call this a rise in populism. What's your take on this?
Well, we've been tracking a phenomenon that we termed Vox Populi risk almost 5 years ago now, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, followed by big mass protests in Russia, India, Brazil, Turkey, and then kind of morphing into the phenomenon that we're seeing now, which is the rise of non-mainstream political parties, not all of which are populist and not all of which are far right, in Europe and in the United States. Now markets have really started to focus on this phenomenon. We think the Vox Populi thesis is really being borne out. It's wrong to call it all populism, but certainly we are looking at disruption in politics and in the advanced economies of the United States and the European Union in a way that most people haven't seen before and therefore don't know how to price and don't recognize. But I also think it's important to remember that it's not a universal phenomenon in the advanced economies either. We don't see this in Canada, for example, in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so it is not a uniform trend either.
But it's especially a trend in Europe, and we've got elections coming up in France, in Germany, we've had elections in the Netherlands. How big a risk is populism and just increasing political risk in general?
Well,
in Europe?
Because we define Vox Populi risk more broadly to include non-mainstream parties, anti-establishment, more generally, not all of which, again, are disruptive. Look at, for example, at Podemos, a centrist party, and there have been other similar parties founded which are just new and challenging the post-World War II sort of political party affiliation. Markets are focused this year following Brexit for obvious reasons because the question is whether there will be Euro disintegration, right? Markets are focused on France, not just because France is an important economy in the European Union, but because it's possible to have a European Union without the UK, possibly without Greece, and maybe even without Italy, although extremely disruptive economically. But politically, you can't have a European Union without France and Germany, and the risk of a Le Pen presidency has really put that front and center.
What would a Le Pen presidency mean then for the EU especially?
Well, it's a big question mark, right? Because we've seen her in the most recent debate, for example, moderate or even sort of avoid some of the previous rhetoric about holding a referendum and everything else. But for our purposes, thinking about how markets might react and what investors will think, a Le Pen strong showing in the first round, although that does not mean that she will win, I think will start to spark some anxiety. And a lot of investors feel that because they missed the Brexit and Trump signals that they're underestimating Le Pen. We still see it as a low probability phenomenon, but clearly high impact. And again, there's only one point for investors, and that is, will Le Pen eventually hold a referendum to take France out of the European Union or out of the common currency, the euro? She's talked about introducing parallel currency and this sort of thing. And there is a risk that investors in that case will run for the exits. But again, for us, this is a tail risk, although clearly a high impact one.
Yeah, and we've talked about Brexit a little bit already, but now we're very close to Theresa May triggering Article 50. The negotiations will start very soon. This process of Brexit negotiations, how disruptive is that going to be for financial markets?
Well, we don't know because we haven't experienced anything like this before, of course. Lots of people, especially Brexiteers, point out that markets have been fairly resilient. The UK economy continues to perform well in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. But of course, the event hasn't happened. And it isn't really going to be a single event. It's going to be a series of signposts. Now, the Article 50 triggering has been very consistently telegraphed. Everyone knows that's going to happen. The European Union has said that it won't have the first meeting on Brexit until a month afterward. One of the things that concerns me is that this 2-year time frame, which the Prime Minister and the government clearly had hoped to have the Brexit process sort of done and dusted before 2020 elections are due, it may not be quite so smooth. We're now looking at not only so-called hard Brexit, leaving the single market, but what some have called a chaotic Brexit. And with that in mind, although we've had denials from Downing Street, I think the political logic of early elections starts to become more compelling when you consider that political capital, that lead that the Conservative Party have in the polls is a diminishing asset.
And we've talked a little bit about the EU in respect to a potential presidency from Le Pen, but also in regards to Brexit. What is the future of the EU, you think?
Well, the way that the European Union works was once described to me like an iceberg moving slowly and flattening everything in its path. And this is a little bit contrary to the way investors tend to see things, right? Where they sort of race ahead of the politics and try to game out the outcomes. European politicians are focused on getting through these elections. We've got through Dutch elections with no, still Geert Wilders' party in second place, but not first place. Now get through French elections and then German elections and then take stock, right? Politicians win elections and then they work out where they're going. And this is really at odds with the way investors tend to see the world, and it's why we end up with these kinds of distortions. So we're not going to have very much clarity about this. I have said, though, that I think that the UK overestimates its negotiating leverage on this front, and the fact that the other, the remaining 27 member states also have a say here. So I don't buy the accusations of punishment for the United Kingdom, but remember what the political imperative for the Commission, for the Council, and for the core European member states is. It's to keep the rest of the Union together. I'd also point out something else that I think is a bit lost in the discussions of populism and political risks, although I'm glad to see it happening, having been talking about it for so long. There is a benign political scenario for Europe this year. We've already had Dutch elections transpire without being too disruptive. Either a Fillon or Macron presidency in France would be market friendly, although we'd have some concerns about Macron having very much political capital. Even Merkel's challenger, Martin Schulz, is pro-EU. So at the end of this year, we could emerge with leaders, probably not very strong leaders, it has to be said, in these more fickle political times, but with leaders with political capital to take Europe forward. And what's interesting is that support for the European Union is actually on a slightly strengthening trend. So people may be disgruntled for various reasons within their own national context, but actually support for the European Union is not as weak as many might think.
Tina Fordham, thank you very much.
Thank you.